Feeding requirements. It was early in the morning. By this time, almost everyone was asleep, with the exception of the two children who didn't require sleep. It was also the time in which Izuku woke up after a refreshing 3 hours of sleep, and went down to the kitchen to start cooking for everyone. And when he got there, to his surprise Yonda and a very groggy Yami with his Beowulf were there waiting for him. Yonda? Yami, did you stay awake all of last night? Please tell me you didn't. Izuku asked her. No father. We woke up early, Yonda explained. Izuku raised an eyebrow at the prospect of Yami sleeping for less than 10 hours. Yami woke up early? She talks loud in my head, Yami said, thoroughly annoyed. And it goes through walls. You wanted to learn how to cook, right? Yonda put her hands on her hips and huffed, clearly not getting what's so irritated about. And you want to help father, so stop complaining. Yami gave a low growl but didn't object any further. In all honesty, when Yonda kept pestering him to get up, if he really wanted to he could have just sent his Beowulf to chase her away. But he agreed with her that learning to cook would help take some of the burdens off Izuku. That and also he could make his own food, so win-win. So you two want to learn how to cook? Izuku thought about it for a moment. On the one hand, he didn't want to burden them, but on the other, cooking was a useful skill that they would need to know if he wasn't around. Alright, since I have to make everyone's breakfast, I guess you two can watch and see how it's done. The two nodded and watched Izuku eagerly. Okay, so first is Fu and Kyosei. He's pretty much always awake and requires a lot of food, but it's pretty simple. Izuku explained. He opened up the refrigerator room and went inside, the two kids hesitantly following him inside and enduring the cold. You see this pile of meat, Izuku said, pointing to a pile of meat that was a bit taller than he was. This is Fu's meal for the day. He only actually needs to eat a few times every now and then, unless he's been using his regeneration a lot. Kyosei slowly eats at Fu, so Fu's food is his food. He eats that much, Yonda said, looking at the pile with wide eyes. It was over 3 times her size. Yeah, he's been training a lot more, so he's had to regenerate more, and so he's had to eat more. Izuku explained. Yami, can you ask the Beowulf to bring that cart here? Izuku pointed to a large cart and Yami nodded, willing his Beowulf to push the cart in front of the pile of meat. Alright, now, all we have to do is load up the cart with about a third of the pile, Izuku explained. And so Izuku filled up the cart, and after a couple minutes the cart was full and he was done. Okay, now we just have to get this onto the table, Izuku said. Don't we have to cook it first? Yonda asked in confusion. No, Fu can't get sick and he can't taste anything either, so it's no different if you give him raw or cooked food, Izuku explained. So cooking all this food would just be a massive waste of time. Yami nodded to show he understood, before ordering his Beowulf to push the cart. At the tables, a few minutes later, the 4 of them, counting the Beowulf, had finished laying out Fu's breakfast, which took up half of one of the extraordinarily long tables. Where does all this go? There's more meat on this table than on his body? Yonda wondered. Well, it's complicated. Basically his body shrinks down the meat and puts it in a special organ that his body uses when he wants to regenerate, Izuku explained as simply as he could. It's like the meat is fuel going into a car, that organ in the fuel tank, and his regeneration is the car. Are we done? Yami asked, wanting to move on. Yes. The next person is Kai, Izuku explained. A few minutes later, a nearby storage house. The storage house was a medium-sized building not too far away from the main building that looked like your average warehouse. Izuku had used it to store the enormous amount of food they had. The children were told what was in here, but were prohibited from entering on account that they might get hurt and or destroy the building. Seeing as it was only Yonda and Yami, he would make an exception. The children looked around the building and saw that it was filled with stacks and stacks of crates. Most of them refrigerated. However, what drew their attention the most were some of the giant crates. These crates were roughly 20 times bigger than the rest of the crates and took up a lot of space in the warehouse. Izuku walked up to one of these giant crates and put his hand on it. This is 1 meal's worth of food for Kai. It's full of fish, and all we have to do is get the fish from here to the outside of his room. And how do we do that? Yonda asked, seriously stumped on how Izuku had been doing this all this time. Izuku walked over to a nearby wall and pushed a button. Then, light poured into the building, as the ceiling opened up. The green-haired teen then pulled out his grim whistle and blew on it. WRRRRRR. After a few moments, a swarm of griffin flew in and landed in front of him. Yonda hid behind Izuku's leg, still not used to the sight of these nightmarish creatures. "Deliver Kai his food," Izuku ordered them. The Grimm flew up and over the crate, before lifting the lid off with their beaks, and throwing it to the side. Then, they dove into the crate and grabbed onto some ropes. They flew up into the air, revealing that underneath the huge pile of fish, was a tarp, that combined with the ropes, would allow them to lift the fish into the sky, which they promptly did, taking it away, to give it to Kai. They already know how to do it, so all you'd need to do is open up the ceiling, call them, tell them what to do, and then close the ceiling back up again, Izuku explained, as he pressed the button again, causing the ceiling to close up. It was so hard to train them to do that. Izuku thought, forgetting that Yonda could hear him for a moment. "So who's next?" Yami asked impatiently. "Well, Sansan doesn't really need to eat, and Shiruka feeds herself, so we don't really have to worry much about special needs until we start making Netsu's food," Izuku explained. "So I guess we can actually start cooking everyone else's food." The two nodded enthusiastically with huge smiles on their faces, eager to get to the actual cooking. "No more wait. Let's go," Yami ordered. Sometime later. In the end, they cooked some simple eggs. Izuku didn't want to overwhelm them with something complicated or hard to make after all, and it was one of Kei's favorites as well. And so together they made food for Yonda, Yami, Eri, Kei, Kiba, Kyoku, and Otoko, and laid them out on the tables. As none of them required special food. Some of them did have special serving requirements, however. Kiba needed some blood on top of her meal, as well as having to be served with a special plate and utensils so she didn't accidentally break them. And Otoko's food needed to be distanced from everyone else as the boy didn't like to be too close to others. Soon enough the children started coming into the cafeteria in search of breakfast and started eating, not letting their appreciation towards Izuku and their two siblings go unnoticed. Kei in particular hugged them all as tightly as she could. Lastly, Mu and Fukunoko needed to have their dishes delivered to their rooms, as neither of them were keen to show their faces. Yami delivered the food to Fukunoko, whom he actually got to see for the first time. Izuku had given him a key that would unlock her room, and since she was asleep there wasn't an issue. So much negativity. Yami had always noticed Fuku's negative emotions, it was hard not to given there was so much of it, but up close, it made him very concerned. "I'll have to ask Dad later." For now, he simply placed the plate on a nearby table, so she could eat it later on. Seeing as Fuku often stayed up late at night and woke up later in the evening, Izuku had allowed her to have a microwave in her room to reheat the meals he left for her. Meanwhile, Yonda was told to place the plate in front of Mu's door, and then turn around. When she did so, she heard some strange sounds behind her, and then a very quiet, "Thank you." And when she turned around, the plate was gone. Once the two were done, they returned to the kitchen where Izuku was preparing to make sausages. "The last meal we have to make is for Netsu. He tends to be a pretty heavy sleeper, so I typically make his food last," Izuku explained as he started making the food. Netsu was pretty hard to make food for because he keeps burning it. DOC had these special cube things for him to eat that were heat-proof, but they tasted terrible, so I decided to find another way. Turns out all you need to do is make the food either undercooked, cold, or frozen, and it'll finish cooking inside of his mouth. You have to be careful though because if it's too unprepared, it might not finish cooking when he eats it, and he could get sick, so you have to be very careful. "Father?" Yonda gave him a concerned, and slightly exhausted look. "This is a lot of work? Do you have to do this every day?" "Every day, 3 times a day," Izuku said. "On top of all my other work, and it's only gonna get harder as time goes on." Wait, she can hear this. It's fine. If anything it's fun." "Yeah, fun." Yonda's look told Izuku exactly how much she believed that. "Well anyway, I'll stick to taking care of Netsu's meals since it requires a lot of care, so you two can sit down and enjoy your food," Izuku told them. The two kids nodded and were about to leave when they suddenly realized something. "What about you?" Yonda asked. Izuku gave them a confused look for a moment before his eyes went wide with realization. "Oh right. You don't have to worry about my food. I eat the same thing as everyone else so you don't have to worry about that. If anything I'll probably just have a piece of toast or something, you two go eat." Yami, hesitantly, left to go eat his food, but Yonda stayed a bit longer. She wanted to object, but her stomach started rumbling, reminding her of her need to eat. And so she walked out to join the other children, and as she was leaving she heard something concerning. "I really need to stop forgetting to eat." A walk between worlds. This place was interesting. It was a lot better than the facility where he had been kept before. He had a room, well he had one before, but this time no one was watching him, so he could be in it without having to use his quirk to gain some privacy. And there was a lot more to do inside of it. But outside his room, there were the other children and Izuku. They were much more interesting and friendly than the people in the suits back at the facility. It made his walks so much more worth going on. Unlike Fukunoko, he didn't enjoy staying in his room all day. But since he didn't like interacting with people much, he used his quirk to go on walks through the house. He'd leave through his door, and walk the halls without his quirk, and when he heard someone or wanted to go through a wall, he'd go into his dimension. Before, he'd just stay in his dimension for the entire walk, but that only gave him 30 minutes to walk around and get back, so Izuku suggested doing it this way. His first stop was the library. This place was typically one of the quietest in the house. Fu was reading some manga over in the corner. Mu was honestly scared of him more so than most of his other siblings. Not really because of the oozing black slime monster that was inside him, it's because his expressionless face and monotone voice made him impossible to read. This unknown element made the boy quite frightening to someone who was used to studying people. Avoiding him, Mu walked over to the three other people in the room. Kyoku, Eri, and Kei. The three of them were huddled together with Kyoku in the middle and Eri and Kei on either side of her, as they all seemed to be reading and talking about the same book. Eri was someone Mu was kind of jealous of. The girl was shy like himself and very scared of most things, like himself, but she was braver than him. Even though she was scared, she still didn't hide, not like he did. He wishes he was more like her. Kei was bursting with energy and was always interesting to watch. And honestly, not all of her puns were terrible, but most of them were. Kyoku was a bit scary. She was always so sure of herself and assertive. The book they were reading was titled, Looking Up to Magical Girls. Well, that seemed like a nice book. Mu walked behind the girls and got a real good look at the book. Oh, those girls were not wearing a lot of clothes, they were also touching each other a lot. Didn't Izuku say that this was how babies were made? But they were both girls? Could two girls make a baby? He'd have to ask Izuku about it later. Isn't this one of those things Izuku said we shouldn't read? Eri asked. Is it? Kei asked. Daddy did say not to read it. Kyoku pouted. I think this is another book those DOC idiots shouldn't have out here. We should tell Daddy. The two other girls nodded, and they ran off to find Izuku. DOC it was a wonder to Mu how they could be so incompetent at times and yet still manage to catch so many powerful children. Regardless, now that the girls were gone, he should go elsewhere. Next was the cafeteria. Not much here today, just Yami asleep on the table after eating a lot of food. Not much out of the ordinary. Yami was strange to him. By all rights, he should have been terrified of the nightmarish-looking boy who could spawn hellish beasts of darkness, but he had gotten used to the Grimm rather quickly. After seeing them be used by everyone as assistants, he got over their appearance rather quickly. And Yami himself had an appearance similar to his own, so that didn't scare him all too much. After all, he wasn't really afraid of physical threat, it was more social situations that scared him. If something tried to attack him he could always just use his quirk, and he was basically invincible. If he tried to do that in the middle of a conversation, that would only lead to more issues later. Since he was a bit hungry, he decided he would eat some chips that Izuku had left as a snack for all of them. There were a lot of flavors and he didn't know which one to pick, so he just picked the regular ones. After that there wasn't much to do, however, Yami had woken up and with urgency, he called his Beowulf and left on top of it. Out of curiosity, Mu followed. They eventually made their way to Yami's room, which Yami promptly went inside. Now, it's not like Mu liked going inside people's rooms without them knowing, but his curiosity tended to get the better of him in many situations. This was one of them. Going through objects was always weird. It's not like he just went through things naturally. If that was the case he would fall through the floor. No, to go through objects he kinda had to push himself through them. It wasn't very hard, but moving through thicker objects often felt like moving through jello for him and could be tiresome after a while. After going through the door, he found that Yami's room was covered in drawings and notes. Taking a closer look, he could see that the drawings were all Grimm, but not any that he had seen before. One was of an ape, with some notes next to it saying, "Has thumbs, can help carry big things." Another one was something that looked like a Beowulf but different. The only thing next to it was the word learning. There were quite a few more, but one drew his attention more than the others. It was a woman. One that looked very similar to Yami with the same white hair, white skin, and black eyes with red pupils. This one gave off an ominous vibe, especially since the words next to her said "I can feel her." He could hear Yami muttering while drawing and writing in a notebook. Getting a bit creeped out, Mu decided it was time to leave. After exiting Yami's room, Fu decided to go to the training room to see if there would be any entertaining fights to watch. When he got there, he arrived at the end of another fight between Kiba and Sanson. This fight happened quite frequently, and honestly, they were his least favorite to watch. At first, watching Sanson fight was fun, but after a while, the fact that no one could harm her made the battles kind of unexciting. That wouldn't stop Kiba from trying. She was relentless in trying to beat an opponent she literally could not hurt. Kiba was one of his favorite people to watch. For many reasons. 1. She was always over the top and her personality and vocabulary typically made him giggle at least once. 2. When she wasn't fighting Sanson, her fights were pretty entertaining. And 3. She was the only one he could watch from his room thanks to her YouTube channel. That being said, he didn't feel the need to stick around for this fight. What point was reading a book when you knew the ending? Given that he didn't have much more time, he decided to go outside. Thankfully it didn't take him very long as he just went through all the floors and walls until he got outside. When he reached the backyard, he found Shiroku going for a jog. Mu actually didn't have much of an opinion on Shiroku. The only real thing he knew about her was that she made clothes, which was nice but didn't really mean much to Mu, whose clothes would disintegrate if he used his quirk for more than a minute. Moving on, Mu started walking towards the greenhouse when in the distance he saw Netsu and Kai fighting. Not like it was hard to see as one of them was on fire and the other was enormous. Netsu and Kai were also pretty fun to watch. Kai seems exceptionally nice and polite, and Mu had even almost considered talking to him once. Netsu was, well, not to sound like Kei, a hothead. He was a bit arrogant, but not overly so, and never to the point where it made him not fun to watch. Observing him try and master his quirk was interesting at the very least. Although if he was being honest, he wished he could see him and Kiba fight. They wanted it so bad that it kinda made him want to see it too. Kai and Netsu spared quite a bit, seeing as Kai was the only person Netsu could fight. Although Kai tended to win most of those fights, Netsu did manage to get some victories, so at least it wasn't as predictable as Kiba v Sanson. However, he didn't have enough time in his dimension to watch the fight today, so he just made his way to the greenhouse. Nothing much tended to happen in the greenhouse. As usual, Otoko was there, but not only him but Yanda was there as well. The two were a fair distance away from each other and just standing there. They were probably having a conversation. Otoko was mute, however, his thoughts weren't. Yanda could actually have conversations with him. Something that the large boy was ecstatic about. Unfortunately, Mu couldn't hear a word. Mu's quirk basically put him in another dimension, meaning as far as Yanda's quirk was concerned, he was just empty space with no thoughts to read. And while he was very relieved about this, it also meant he was immune to her telepathy while in his dimension, which made watching her interact with people very confusing. Seeing as the only thing here was a wordless conversation, Mu decided to go back to the house. After all, he had one more stop. Later, in front of Fuku's room, Mu exited his dimension and looked up at the metal door of his one and only friend. He hesitated. The idea of interacting with anyone still scared him, but this was his friend. Knock knock. Ah, Mu heard his friend scream. There was a bit of panic shuffling before he got a response. WW, who is it? And Mu answered, just loud enough for her to hear. There was a bit of a pause before the door slid open and Mu ran in. Some time ago, Mu discovered Fuku hiding in her room and became fascinated with her. She clearly had many talents and interests, but she locked herself away in her room. At first, he respected the fact you shouldn't enter a girl's room without permission. However, as he started to get more and more glimpse of her, the more curious he got. Watching her happily go about her business and knit or cook or mess around with her plant 1 minute, and then completely lose it the next when she came into contact with someone. Eventually, he waited till she re-entered her room and followed her in. He'd been delighted to see she was still just as fun to watch, as she talked to herself quite frequently, and reacted in fun, over-the-top ways to basically anything. Sad scene in anime, her eyes turned into waterfalls. Here's a joke she finds funny. She got worried she would die with laughter. And then she started writing. Apparently, the girl had an interest in writing stories, and this was the best part of watching her, if he was honest. Fuku had a great creative mind, which was mostly used to imagine why people would hate her and how they might exact their wrath upon her. But when this imagination was used for something more constructive, it was remarkable. It wasn't just what she was writing, it was how she wrote. She would write things down with such energy and fervor, putting down paragraph after paragraph in only a few minutes while talking aloud excitedly about her story, only to suddenly stop and go back to edit and alter her work, scolding herself all the while. Mu found himself observing her longer than he should have, and he started disappearing. He panicked and left his dimension, revealing himself to Fuku and causing them both to completely freak out. Long story short, Fuku was completely freaked out by Mu and his quirk, and Mu felt very guilty about invading her privacy like this, but didn't know how to convey those feelings through conversations due to lack of experience, and in the end, Izuku needed to step in. After scolding Mu for invading Fuku's privacy, they had made an agreement. Fuku didn't feel that her door would be effective in stopping Mu from coming in, so she made a deal with him. If he wanted to see her, then she would let him in, but he had to not be in his dimension. The thought of someone being in her room she couldn't see or hear freaked her out a lot, and while she didn't like the idea of people being in her room, it was less scary than the former idea. And so now, at least twice a week, Mu would go into Fuku's room and they would do what they enjoyed doing together: writing stories. Fuku never left her room, so she never saw what her siblings got up to outside of her room unless she was watching Kiba's videos. Mu saw plenty of things with his quirk and was happy to share them with her to provide inspiration for their writing. They were reading what? Fuku's face turned red. Yeah, and they were doing it in the hands of this big lady, Mu explained. He typically only stayed for an hour, there was only so much social interaction they could take, but it was nice for the both of them. This place was pretty amazing if you asked Mu. After all, nothing here was ever boring.